Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is HydeCon again, and I suppose this is going to end up being Notes on the Revolution in America Part 2, because I wasn't particularly satisfied with where I left off following my previous video. And I just wanted to add a few things, as sort of an addenda to what I said yesterday. Uh, of course, I wasn't going to make the video yesterday any longer than it already was because it already ended up being 44 minutes of me rambling incoherently. But nonetheless, we'll try to push forward with these brief addenda items, with much more gusto than I stumbled through my points yesterday. And perhaps this will end up being sort of a daily or semi-daily sort of space for reflection. I'm not entirely sure. But what I want to talk about is I wasn't particularly satisfied with the way that I left the question hanging yesterday about as to what we're going to do following all the phenomenon that we've seen exhibited these past few days, this past week and a half or so, particularly trends such as the normalization of political violence, trends such as, particular individuals being a little bit more brazen in attempting to get certain members of the community fired from their jobs for lack of veneration towards certain nonprofit organizations, and just other generally worrying cultural trends that there doesn't seem to be a good way to combat at the current moment. But when I when I left you guys, I didn't feel like I actually gave anyone any causes for hope or any good reasons not to despair. And I find that was probably irresponsible on my part. And perhaps it was because I myself hadn't really thought through my answer enough to give everyone an answer that was satisfactory, that would be good and helpful and productive going forward. But I've given it some thought, and there are just a few things that I wanted to add on to my analysis from yesterday. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was my characterization of the American nation as being fundamentally dead, or the intangible aspects that ensured a kind of historical continuity in the United States of people and heritage from 1776 and beforehand to the current day has been interrupted, was essentially my my thesis. And I do agree that that is the case. However, I think perhaps we're a little bit too defeatist about this particular fact. Well, first of all, it is in the nature of nations to change, and the United States is no exception. And second of all, I would say, while this, sort of intangible connection that we have to the founding myths of the American Republic is faded or almost entirely gone, it doesn't mean that the American people are gone. And this is something that I want to stress as well, is that the right nowadays is fundamentally a populist entity. We're fundamentally for the people, and specifically for the working classes. And as such, we oftentimes neglect the fact that we have this substantial human capital. We talk about the failures of our silent majority, but we don't talk about strategies to actually turn the latent potential of our sort of silent majority, even if it doesn't actually comprise a majority but merely a plurality. We don't talk about ways to transform that plurality into something that has political energy, that is politically useful. And of course, that's a mistake, because while we can't necessarily seize the levers of power, we can at least use what little power we do have to try to carve out spaces for ourselves. And, moreover, because we have this, human capital, so to speak, in regards to our, our implicit support among specifically the white working class. Although, some minorities in general, hashtag not all, but in general, the reactionary politics in America are sort of a white working class phenomenon. And, I believe what we've forgotten perhaps is that when barbarians take over a powerful empire, like the Roman Empire, for example, it's usually often the case that the ruling classes of these conquered nations are, transformed, and all of a sudden you have a Visigothic king on the throne or what have you. But the actual populations of people in those areas usually remain unchanged. Now, of course, there are certain demographic problems in the United States that render this a much more debatable point. But I think, nonetheless, I sort of agree with the sentiment that the white working class is not really going anywhere. It may decline as a share of the U.S. population, but I think eventually it'll sort of stabilize again into our sort of reliable plurality. And what this allows us to do is to, when we do build up afterwards, when we build up our communities and our coalitions, this allows us to make an indelible mark on what comes afterwards. So, even though the Goths sacked Rome, and even though the ruling classes of the Western Roman Empire in many places became Germanic, this, wide, broad-based Roman culture became the foundation of the cultures that would arise out of it, even if the ruling classes were of Germanic stock. And the primary example of this, of course, is that most of the languages in Europe, French, Spanish, Italian, and so forth, or at least most of the more influential ones, are Romance languages. And Latin was an intensely, Latin and Roman culture was intensely important in the foundation of many European nations as we understand them today. So just because the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, passed out of existence as a political entity does not necessarily mean that all of its cultural and intangible institutional force was spent. There's another point that I would like to make about our silent majority, is that our silent majority may not stay silent so long as the incentive structures that exist for them being silent are beginning to be eroded away. We've already seen the phenomenon that it is not enough for people to remain silent. They must affirm the doctrine. And, as it stands, some people will affirm the doctrine. But if there's anything that I know about, generally our sort of people, are the people who form the stock of our sort of implicit political movement, it's that they do have some dignity. And while people of a more liberal middle class background will tend to kowtow to sort of cultural shibboleths if it maintains their career and standing in the community, people who are on the outs economically and culturally oftentimes have less to lose by burning a pinch of incense to Caesar, so to speak. And it may be the case that as the political and cultural situation in the country deteriorates, that the incentive structures that keep people from being explicitly reactionary in their politics and in their way of interacting with the culture, those incentives begin to go away. And I wouldn't put it past people entirely, in order to maintain their dignity as human beings, to join the resistance, as it were. Just because I don't believe that all people necessarily are spineless. And even if all people are spineless, I don't think that they necessarily always are correct in their cost-benefit analysis of what political steps they take in calculating their own path forward in life. But that's one aspect of it, and perhaps that doesn't come to pass, and perhaps it does. I suppose we'll have to see on that. There's another question that I've been kicking around, and that's this. There's been a lot of doom and gloom. There's been a lot of, oh, the cities are under siege, the cities have been captured, and so on and so forth. And the question that this leads me to ask is, do we actually believe our values? Do we believe, for example, that people need hierarchy and order and legitimacy and authority? And if we do believe those things, and if those things are true, then these metro areas falling to the zeitgeist, as lamentable as it may be, this may represent, again, an opportunity for the growth of reactionary ideas in America. Now, this is not to say that we can sit back and watch as the election is delivered to us. That's not what I'm saying at all, because this isn't even about elections. This is about proving our point in concrete realities in ways that people physically on the ground cannot ignore, because this is something that has been going on for a long time, is that there's been a negligence of an understanding that things on the ground do in fact matter, that the world actually isn't completely comprised of what goes on the internet, and that people can be complacent in their internet echo chambers, but people cannot be complacent when the revolution comes to their community. And even if it's a lamentable thing, and I don't want people's neighborhoods to be burned and looted, and I don't want the new cultural orthodoxy to be enforced over people, but the more that this occurs in real life, with the actual physical force of the state, or the physical force of cultural revolutionaries and their proxies, the more that you will see that sane people will adopt our ideas implicitly. And if we allow a space for those people, if we do other, activities that would allow a coalition to form, well, then we might see a manifestation of that explicitly. Again, this is not the same thing as to say that this will hand us elections or make us instantly win because things get bad. That is not what I'm saying. I am saying that if we believe our ideas are true and we see these policies put into action, which, I don't believe they'll actually for a minute defund the police, but certainly slashing police budgets, cutting police officers, and demoralizing the police will lead to spikes in things like, for example, violent crime. If we believe these things are true, and we foster a place for the people who are shaken out of their comfortable bubbles by the intrusion of ideology into the material conditions of their lives, well, then we might have a political boon. At the very least, it's something that we can't ignore. There's another question, and that has been about, what is the proper response for people like us, for people who are already politically engaged with reactionary ideas, for people who are, on the way into starting families, into starting careers, because many of us are young men. But what is it that we're intending to do? Now, the first option seems to be to try to integrate into society as sort of sleeper cells. And this is proving to be less and less of a option as sort of the commissar has become more and more interested in sniffing out heretics that don't speak up within the ranks. So that being the case, I think it's time that we perhaps open up a discussion about, the theme of this discussion, I believe, has been taking ideology, or taking the applications of our ideology and putting them in real life. And it may be the case that the best option that we have going forward is to, in real life, associate with people who are like us, who share our ideas. And it perhaps may be the case that in order to prevent our online networks from collapsing and our political movement to be dead on arrival because our online networks have collapsed, perhaps it's time to create in real life networks. This has sort of been the project of Canis Society, which has been stymied by various unfortunate events, as well as just the general lack of ambition of its members, of which I am a part and wholly guilty of. Perhaps it's time, for example, for us to begin to geographically locate, around one another. There are plenty of communities in the United States where housing is relatively cheap, and we might assist one another in the way that other relatively small ethnic and religious minorities assist one another in foreign countries by building those sorts of structures in meat space, so to speak, that would allow us to live our lives with a sense of normalcy, insulated in some respect by being in proximity to one another, and more importantly, not relying on progressives for the supply of our material wants. So, reactionaries need to be able to employ other reactionaries. They need to be able to provide housing for other reactionaries, and moreover, young up and coming reactionaries need to be prepared to work for other reactionaries, those that serve or those that have property or have assets that are interested in building businesses and building economic enterprises that would allow the movement to succeed. And this is going to sound a lot like Rod Dreher's Benedict option, because it's heavily influenced. It's heavily influenced right-wing thought in the past 5 to 10 years, or whenever the book came out. I don't know exactly, but it's been rather influential in right-wing conservative religious thought. And this is because Christians in America, and this is going to include us, need to begin, as I said, operating as the ethnic and religious minority that we are. And that means building those support structures. I'm repeating myself again and again, but you get the point. I think this is going to take the form of moving into, perhaps this is ambitious, but perhaps it could take the form of several individuals connected online moving into a particular neighborhood where the housing is cheap and being able to fix up a neighborhood. And perhaps this would also rely on a sort of religious foundation provided by, for example, some kind of lay apostolate, because there is this problem in specifically Catholic communities, I would say, where we need more clergymen, or we need more spiritually attuned elder men, for example, or just mentors in general who can guide people in their spiritual journey. But we also need more fathers. We need more families. We need to do the business of building up civilization. And perhaps the answer to that is something like some sort of lay apostolate, or our own particular brand of something like the Knights of Columbus. I'm not particularly sure about that. Those are just some ideas I've thrown around. But before I go, I'd just like to shoot down a particular objection to some of the things that I've outlined here, especially in terms of crossing over our intentions of crossing over into quote unquote real life. And that is this: what if all of this comes to naught? If it is true that progressivism is in the ascendancy, that the so-called spiteful mutants will seize the levers of power, what is to stop us from getting Ruby Ridged or Waycode or any number of these sort of egregious oversteps of federal authority that end up in these sorts of armed conflicts? And if we don't maintain arms to protect ourselves, then that would make us just even the easier target to seem like we can't win. To that I say, well, it is all, to be fair, a SWAT team could break into your house at any time and shoot you in your bed, and claim it was an accident. It's If we're worried about exercise of state violence against us, first of all, perhaps that's a overinflation of how threatening we are or perceived to be to the powers that be. But moreover, the question becomes, what else are you going to do? Are you going to give up your dignity? Are you going to give up your free exercise of religion? Are you going to give up everything that you believe to be true to avoid state violence? Or are you going to attempt to do something with your life? And it seems to me that the latter option is, even if it does result in one being the victim of state violence or mob violence or any sort of other violent end, it seems to me that there is only one possible path forward for anybody who is serious about reactionary ideas or serious about preserving the traditions, heritage, culture, and people of these United States or of any country in the Western world, and particularly in preserving the heritage and preserving the traditions and free practice of the Christian church. There is no other option. You either become engaged, do the hard work, and perhaps suffer the consequences, or you slink away into the dark and, well, you compromise on everything. You compromise on your principles, you compromise on your beliefs, and you die inevitably a coward. And I myself am a coward. But I, like everyone else, rely on other people to, to fortify my morale, to allow to give me the strength that I need to face these challenges in life. And I also rely on my faith in God, although it does waver in these days sometimes. And I'm ashamed of that. But the solution to all of these problems, the solution to all the insanity that we have witnessed the past week and a half, the past year, the past several years, the answer to this insanity is not to slink away and go softly into that good dark. This has been the Hidebound Convivium. Thank you for tuning in, and God bless.